All right, we've made it to the end of the process, and this is very exciting, but it's also time to sort of take stock of where we are. Because what we did in the first half was come to a rough that we were happy with. If we could have just sort of stood far away from this thing and squinted at it, we'd call it finished. That was the image. But we do need to have a little more detail, a little more resolution. So the second half was trying to enlarge that while keeping it as close to our original vision as possible. Well, life happens. In the middle, you have a lot of opportunities to go off course. Now, sometimes some of those are going to be improvements, but let's just pretend for a minute that really we nailed it with the rough. We spent a long time on it, and we got to a place where that was what we wanted. So now our task is, how do we keep all the cool details and brushstrokes, but bring it back at sort of a high level to look like our rough? How do we get our value pattern reading like the clarity and the simplicity of the rough? Well, this is what I call final balancing. And to put it in really simple terms, what if we had, two areas of value and the edge between them has a certain amount of contrast? Well, if I wanted to direct the viewer's eye to look at this, I would want that contrast to be higher. So I might cheat the rendering a little bit and actually slowly darken one value as it approaches the edge so that there's a little more pop, so that one stands out more than the other. Or alternatively, if I said I don't want the viewer to look at this edge very much, I want to de-emphasize it, well then I'd cheat the rendering in the opposite direction. I would raise the value such that they are closer to one another and have less contrast. And when you do this, if there's other parts of your image, all of a sudden this one is going to be less important, and the viewer is going to look wherever there's higher contrast. So this is our balancing act. Our image has a lot of different edges, and all of them are competing with one another. And then when we look at the rough, it's a little more simple. Because it doesn't have all those details for the eye to get excited about, it has sort of a clarity to it. I look at the two side by side, and I'm just going to decide what is the detail one missing. And one thing that immediately jumps out at me is this nice bright stripe of illuminated ground. In the rough, it really separates the ground plane from the wall, but it kind of got lost in my final image. So I just need to add in that extra brightness. And the way I choose to do it in this case is to use an adjustment layer with levels, and then to use a mask on that adjustment layer to limit where it's affecting. So it's really only affecting this little stripe of brightness. And you'll notice me flipping the canvas a lot while I do this. I have a keyboard shortcut that allows me to very quickly flip canvas horizontally. And what that does is just give me a quick, fresh read. Sometimes when you just look at something in one direction, you'll stop seeing the mistakes, but if you flip it, the mistakes will become apparent. Another one of the problems that tends to crop up in paintings is you get contrast creep, which is to say, too much local contrast, and it's distracting. Well, I have that problem in my shadow areas. In the rough, there's a nice sort of two-tone quality. There's the illuminated area, and there's the shadow, and it makes a nice graphic shape. But as I added all these details into my final, it gets a little more cluttered. So what I love to do is actually just use the airbrush tool, very, very big and low opacity, and just paint over top of all these details. I'm essentially averaging out and lowering the contrast to just reduce the emphasis. Because there's a lot of stuff to look at in this image, and I'm not erasing it completely, but I'm just sort of dulling it down. And it's amazing what a difference this makes. It might seem counterintuitive, I spent all that time putting in those details, why am I now taking it back? But really, it's just a balancing act. If you have too many details everywhere in your image, your viewer doesn't have anywhere to rest. They don't know what's cool because everything is equally cool, and so it's just confusing. So in a sense, when I do this, I'm just deciding for them. You, viewer, don't look here. Look at the biker. He's the focal point. This stuff on the wall is interesting, it's set dressing, but it's not what you should be looking at right now. And the way I do that is with contrast. So really, sometimes removing is just as important as adding. Now, another thing I worked on at this point is trying to make the foreground objects a little less flat, because really it's important that they stay silhouetted. But since we're seeing them at such a steep angle, it's actually a great opportunity to bring in that angle of incidence. And if you remember from Basic Rendering 3, this is where certain objects are more reflective when viewed at a steep angle. So things like bricks, as they bend around the corner, are going to catch a little more reflection than when they are in the deeper shadow. And I could apply this realistically to everything in the image if I wanted to, but I'm deciding to sort of selectively use it here to give a neat sort of graphic border to the foreground elements, just to give them a little bit of interest as they recede away from us without distracting too much from the rest of the image. And what I really love about doing this is that it engages the viewer. Because when I indicate that there's a brick here or that there's a crack in the wall, but then you don't see any more details because they fade off into shadow, immediately your imagination is activated. You as the viewer understand this is all one surface, and I can see a little bit of detail here peeking out of the shadow. So I fill in the details. My brain imagines an entire wall filled with details, more rich than any painter could ever make. And come on, that's a wonderful efficiency, right? You, the painter, indicate that there's detail. You sort of hint at it, and then let the viewer do the work. This is great. It makes it more detailed to them than you could ever paint it, and for you, it's less work. So whenever possible, I really like to just sort of hint at detail instead of laying it all out there. So in looking at my thumbnail, I still see a little more sort of graphic separation between foreground and middle ground than I'm achieving in my final. It's a little more cluttered in the final version. So just like in our very basic examples at the beginning, what we want is visual separation. And there's a lot of different ways to achieve this. But for me right now, I'm feeling like this is an opportunity for thick atmosphere. Remember atmospheric perspective that we talked about in Basic Rendering 3? Well, here is a great chance. This is a slum, which means there's probably going to be pollution and dust and other particles floating around. Well, if there's particles in the air, there is going to be a natural dulling effect. As you look through these particles, the middle ground is just going to be lower contrast. So in painting in sort of a fog haze, it's an efficient way to enhance that visual separation. Now the background is dropped back a bit, and just putting in a few little light beams and floating dust motes is going to enhance the effect. Because what it also serves to do is give sort of a general softness to the atmosphere around the character to play as a nice contrast against the hard edge of the motorcycle. And speaking of softness, the final step that I do here is actually to sort of isolate the middle ground, the biker and then the space in front of him. I want to keep this sharp. But then the background and the very foreground, I just blur them a little bit. Now, we're not doing extreme depth of field like some photograph. It's just enough to control the viewer's eye. Because just like contrast, the viewer's eye is going to be attracted to things that are sharp and in focus. So if you have something that you don't want them immediately to look at, if you just soften it ever so slightly, it's going to help kind of keep their eye away from it, and instead keep their eye on the focal point. So at the very end of an image, I like to do a little bit of selective blurring and selective sharpening. Not very much, just enough to remind the viewer where they should be looking. But the point of all this is that we have now balanced the image through selectively de-emphasizing certain areas and emphasizing other areas. Now it has a much more clear read. I think comparing the two side by side makes it pretty obvious. At the end of the detail overlay phase, it looked detailed, sure, but now it has more focus. It has more clarity and more intent. And really that's what we're doing. We are telling a story. So it's nice to be able to explain neat little details and cool special effects, but really all that is just dressing. What you're actually doing is telling a story. So if you can do that with less detail, good, go for it. But I'm happy to say that I have now achieved the intent of my rough, but realized in sort of a fully finished painting. And that's when a painting's done for me. I started with a thumbnail. That was the idea. I then clarified that idea by making a rough. And the rough was really where I figured out all the nitty-gritty problems and solved them with a value pattern that was clear. I let the sort of tonal distribution make the story evident. And then at that point, the ideas were all done. Then it was just execution. Now, in the process of doing the execution, it got a little off track, and that's normal. So then finally, I brought it back together with the final balancing to make the final image really remind us of the rough, and that's it. So when you make your own paintings, you don't have to mirror my process exactly. In fact, when I paint, I don't always paint in such a rigid way. But I think some of these key phases are worth reproducing, especially the idea of being careful and intentional about your rough, spend as much time as you need getting to a nice solution, and then the final balancing. It's really easy to stop at the end of your sort of detail pass and to not give it that final tweak. But really, this final tweaking and balancing that you do is what brings that clarity back to the image. And then what you're left with is something that's very clear and the audience just gets it. So congratulations on getting all the way through the basic rendering series. I hope you spend the time that you need to spend drawing boring stuff like still lifes and vases, but really it all builds up to this fun final image. And in the big picture, that's what you're going to spend most of your time doing. So study hard, learn the basics, focus on that foundation, and then you'll have years of, motorcycles and dragons and space marines. Have fun painting, guys. Thanks for coming to the site.